This is Universal Lunch, Out of Office Hours, a limited-run live-streamed web series on the occasion of Futurespective, an exhibition with events and happenings that demonstrate how design inquiry engages in open-ended, extra-disciplinary exchange. Futurespective runs through December 14th at the Institute of Contemporary Art at the Maine College of Art in Portland, Maine. I'm Jimmy Liu in Austin, Texas. My co-host, Gabrielle Esperdy, is away this week. Futurespective asks a simple question. What does it mean to rethink the past in the present to point to the future? And each Thursday, for the duration of the exhibition, we will gather a diverse group of thinkers and makers to kick around answers to this question relative to design, culture, or anything else our guests want to discuss. Hello, everybody. I'm back from travel, and this week, though, Gabrielle is away, and she's actually away at a speaking engagement at the Cincinnati Preservation Association's Fall Forum on Preservation, and she's at a book signing for her new book, American Autotopia. At the Preservation Association, Gabrielle is talking about overlooked women who help shape the course of modern architecture as a practice and profession. Her talk will highlight the work of pioneering modern architect Nathalie Deblois, designer of Cincinnati's Terrace Plaza, and many of Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill's most iconic mid-20th century buildings. I'm also excited to plug her new book, American Autotopia, and I'm excited to talk to her about her new book when she gets back next week. What is going on this week for me? Here are some things I'm paying attention to. Over the weekend, one half of the Art Guys passed away. As you may know, the Art Guys is a Houston-based collaborative art team, and the one half of them who's passed away is Michael Galbraith. The Art Guys have been described by the New York Times as, quote, a cross between Dada and David Letterman, John Cage and the Smothers Brothers. And they have often used humor and everyday materials as a way to demystify art in an attempt to welcome a broad range of audiences into the discourse of contemporary art. So there is a beautiful write-up about the Art Guys on glasstire.com, which is an online arts publication based out of Texas. Also, this week, I'm trying something new. I'm broadcasting from my office, but my office has a window to the hallway. And I've put up the live stream out there, and there's people walking by and watching. So if I seem distracted, it may be because there's someone staring at me from a window. The other thing that I'm paying attention to this week is the CCA Design Division lecture series in collaboration with the Curatorial Practice Research Bureau, who are bringing in graphic designer Na Kim, and she is doing not only a lecture, but an installation, a series of wall drawings, and I believe that is happening tonight. The lecture is happening tonight. I'm still recovering from traveling last week to the Vancouver Art Book Fair, which was a pretty awesome experience, I think. It was our first time tabling at an art book fair and also first time in Vancouver, which is a wonderful city. But it was odd to find out that Vancouver is smaller than Austin. It's like 600,000 people, but it seemed much bigger in terms of the presence of art and culture, and the presence of Asian Americans. It was nice to be in a city where every other person seemed to be of Asian American descent. It was kind of empowering, and every other restaurant in Vancouver seems to be an Asian restaurant, which was also delightful. And on today's episode, I will be talking with Nat Pyper and Janet Abrams, two people who I don't know, but I'm very excited to be in conversation with them today. So I guess without further ado, let's get started. My first guest is Nat Pyper, and they are an alphabet artist. In their work and writing, they use language as a sieve, and they push the body through it. They maintain an ongoing research practice on queer anarcho-punk zines of the late 80s and early 90s, and are a 2018 graduate of the Yale School of Art. They previously worked as a designer at the Milwaukee Art Museum and organized the Designers Talking series. Nat Pyper, welcome to Universal Lunch. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Yes, welcome. Where are you today? I'll start with that.
Yeah, so I'm in my living room in Chicago, Illinois.
Oh, you're in Chicago now. Okay.
Yes.
What's the weather like there today?
It's pretty cold. It's like in the 40s today, so.
Oof, okay. Still, well, almost winter, right? Almost the thick of winter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I just want to dive in because I have so many things I want to talk to you about today. And the first thing that I want to talk about is at Universal Lunch, we're interested in not just the work that you're producing, but also the ideas that feed the work. And I kind of want to talk to you about tracing a line backwards through your education, your formative experiences as a human, and try to unpack some of those either experiences, institutions, or people who shaped what we might call your school of thought. So what can you tell us about how your particular perspective as a quote-unquote alphabet artist, how is that formed? Take me back.
Yeah, cool. I love this question. I want to talk about a professor that I had in undergrad. Her name was Carol Pagel, and she was a writing professor, and I took a writing course with her, and it just was like an incredible experience, and she's an incredible person, and I think it was like during the course of that class, she recommended this book to me, which is called Please Kill Me, The Uncensored Oral History of Punk. And she said it's going to change your life. And I didn't believe her, but it totally did. And not just for like what was in the book itself, but also just for like the ways that it was bringing in all these different voices that were often contradicting and agreeing, and the tone of the whole book was really magical, I guess.
Remind us where you went to school?
What?
Remind us where you went to school?
Oh, yeah. So I went to the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And did you study design there?
Yes, I studied graphic design there. Yeah.
Okay. And okay, so I was listening to your Scratching the Surface interview, maybe from almost a year ago, right? And on it, you talked a little bit about how Yale kind of changed you in a really significant way. And, you know, your work, I don't know if that was when it began to focus more on queerness, but I kind of want to take that idea back to before school, to your formative years.
Sure.
How can you talk a little bit about how you came into understanding your queerness as a kid? How did you grow up? Was it, I mean, you are maybe not quite a millennial, right? Maybe, no, different generation. You are.
I think so.
You classify yourself as millennial?
I haven't really thought about it in those terms, but I think I'm in that category.
Okay, yeah, we might be close in age. Okay, so yeah, talk to me about that. Like, what was it like growing up and trying to understand that for you? Easy, difficult, challenging?
That was, as far as like queerness goes, it was something that I was in denial of for a really long time, um, through high school, and I think that it was. I grew up in a Christian family, very conservative background, and so I think there was a lot of this pressure from family and peers in school and church and all these things to perform in a certain way. And so it wasn't until undergrad that I started trying to figure more of that out for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it was what I really was kind of like surprised about when I got to undergrad was that you got to choose your life.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it's an incredible feeling. I mean, I think because like so much too, even in high school, even your friends, everything is kind of given to you. You kind of are just like, okay, this is what's around me, so I'm going to make do with what's here. And then to go somewhere and realize that you get to have control over those things was really refreshing and eye-opening. And so I think that's when I started to really actually become a person.
Who told you that? Like, I mean, we all discover it, I think, in college, but can you think about when that was like a conscious thing that you're like, wait a minute, I can actually choose to
Yeah.
make my life how it is?
I mean, I think it was something that happened, honestly, like the first night that I got to school. Like, we moved into the dorms, and I met these two people, my friend Ashley Yankee and Phil Enderby, and immediately we were like thick as thieves, and I'm still really good friends with both of them. But I think it was like the first time that I was like, I also like saw people or like met people that I could like relate to on a really intense personal level that I hadn't necessarily been able to in high school. And it was like, oh, whoa, I don't have to just like hold all of the difference. I can like find other people like me.
What was it about them? Also, shout out to Ashley and Phil.
Yeah, Ashley and Phil. Yeah, they were just like really, I don't know, great folks. Funny, had good music taste. All these things that I don't know. We're just like, I think too, like one thing that's really special and fun about starting school is that everyone's immediately looking for friends. There's no like, when you move to a new city and you are new and you don't necessarily know people, you kind of have to like break in and meet people and try to find a community that way. But when you start school somewhere, it's all new, and everyone's desperate for friends and for community, and so people are kind of vulnerable in a unique way that you won't find in other spaces. And I think also that like lends itself for people becoming really close really fast too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's so hard to like recreate that as an adult, right? Like, like it's so hard because everyone is like has their life all together, and they're like, no new friends.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is a bummer.
Yeah, it is. But also, I get it.
Yeah, I get it too.
I want to jump a little bit forward now in time. You describe yourself as an alphabet artist, and in a previous interview, you kind of said that, I call myself that as a way of getting out of describing or trying to be pigeonholed into a thing, a name, a label to call yourself and your practice.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of condition seems to be really prevalent these days with a new generation of graphic designers who are kind of resistant to call themselves graphic designers and have to come up with a new language. Can you unpack some of that for me, about your decision to say that you're an alphabet artist, but your work is decidedly based in design?
Mhm.
How do you think about that now after a while of calling yourself alphabet artist? How is
Mhm.
that definition sitting with you?
Mhm. Well, I definitely don't have any qualms with the term graphic designer. I'll say that, and I I think that my like what I wanted to do by calling myself an alphabet artist is that it's I like that it's a very like ambiguous term, but also kind of sums up what I do in my practice, which is just work with language in different ways, whether it be writing or design or fonts or performative pieces that have text on them. Um, it's able to kind of sum up in a way that I don't have to like write this list of like designer, artist, researcher, writer, blah 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 blah.
How do others encounter that term? Either artists or designers. How has that term been received by the people who see that as your label?
That's a good question. I don't really know. I haven't talked about it with a lot of people, and I really don't have a problem with however people decide they want to describe me, whether that be designer, artist, or writer, or whatever. Um, and I think it's kind of just a way for me to, like from my perspective, to be able to describe what I do. And I also like that it's that I can evade telling people what I do a little bit. I
Uh-huh.
like that it's sort of this strange, yeah, like not super clear descriptor of my work. And part of why I like that is that I feel like it leaves it open for other um, other sorts of developments along the way.
Yeah, it seems like ambiguity is increasingly important
Hmm.
to next generations of people. Like, I feel
Yes.
like my students are all fluid.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think there's some uh, value in um, letting it be like a little ambiguous. I think it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think I so much of that ambiguity is like based in language, in the ways that we talk
Hmm.
about ourselves, the way that we describe ourselves, and I think anytime we rush to um, use language to define ourselves or others, I think we're doing a disservice to the power of language itself. And I think that I think it's also important in this time where our identities are being atomized and,
Hmm.
plugged into algorithms so that, we can get more stuff sold back to us. I feel like that blurriness is kind of important. It's kind of an
Hmm.
important place to just rest in. Um,
Do you
yeah.
think of it as a form of protest?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of that for me is definitely not like I'm not protesting like any sort of. I don't feel like I like wake up and I'm like I'm protesting the man today. But I think that it's like I think that it's a way to, and not just like I think protests like our everyday assumptions of the way that the world should work, and protest like our own assumptions, um, and allow that like uncertainty to actually be a place that we want to spend time in and not avoid.
Um, let's talk about what you're reading. Last I heard, you were reading about orality and literacy.
Yes.
And you mentioned Frere.
Yes.
How are you with those things right now? Because I think you mentioned that you had a lot of questions about language and its ability to both capture and liberate us.
Yeah.
Yeah, what are you thinking about in terms of that area today?
Yeah. Still thinking a lot about literacy through those texts that you mentioned. Thinking about, so like, Paulo Freire was very insistent that literacy can be liberatory, and that literacy can be used to oppress peoples by teaching them a certain way to read, teaching them a certain way to see the world, and to reproduce the world. But literacy can also be this incredible uh, uh, freeing tool that can actually help us to start to reconstitute the world. So, his thinking is that, all right, once we can read the world on our own terms, then we can start to rewrite it. And I think that was really important for his for working with class students in Brazil and helping them escape the conditions that were materially oppressing them. And I think that's something that we can continue to take with us and consider. And also, like, encourage a playful, unexpected approaches to language and the way that we use it, and allowing that to produce new ways of relating to each other, of being in conversation. Yeah.
So, when you talk about Freire, I can't help but think about the idea of remaking the world, as having a direct relation to a way of thinking about design.
Yeah.
And yeah, are you thinking about Freire? Obviously you are thinking about Freire in relation to design. And so how does that manifest for you when you think about his ideas in relation to a design practice?
Yeah. Well, I'll also say that I'm also reading Kathy Acker, who is kind of like
Okay.
on the other side of language when it comes to that, and she's all for like more obfuscation, more blurring of the eye, more confusion, and so I'm kind of like swinging between those two poles right now.
Yeah.
And
Is that a comfortable feeling? Is that a productive feeling?
yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's. I mean, I'm enjoying it. Yeah, I think I'm holding back from any sort of like application of these readings like onto um, maybe necessarily like a design methodology, just because yeah, I think that I don't know. I think I want to be wary of understanding the ways that like design is used to condition the world in certain ways, and yeah, just being mindful of intentions and um, motivations for wanting to condition the world.
So a lot of your work appears in the form of performance.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how you see performance in relation to your practice, but also, I mean, it seems to be very much when I see it, it seems to be very much pointing towards design in some way.
I'm sorry. What was the question?
Can you talk a bit about your practice of performance and how you see that maybe, yeah, how does that point back to design? Or how do you see it pointing back to design?
Yes, I have performance side to my practice, and usually relates to I'm interested in like the ways that language being the spoken word, the written word, and also the images and other things that we use to communicate. I'm interested in what effects, what tangible material effects language has on the world around us, and specifically like down to the scale of like a body. And so that's kind of where I've brought my own body into it. I want to kind of use, I'm using my body as this like starting point to understand what happens when language and bodies meet in maybe unexpected ways. And so I also create a lot of like wearable pieces that I employ in the performances, and these kind of function as like mediators of between like a language and a body, and for me it's like it's the works themselves end up being maybe a little bit more a little less like they're not necessarily designed for like practical application, but I do create them with a use in mind, and within like the context of a performance or video work, I'm designing these wearables and then using them to kind of like play these language games.
Can you, for our viewers who are unfamiliar with your performances, can you describe what one such performance entails?
Sure. So there's this okay, so I think I have a piece nearby.
Yes, please.
So there's this work that I made a year or two ago called Get Ups for a Get Down, and these are felt pieces that are designed for the club, and
like the dance club.
Yeah, the dance club.
Okay.
And so it's for it's these pieces to be worn when you're like dancing in ecstasy with others on the dance floor. And I started thinking of like the dance floor, especially like queer dance spaces, as these really like freeing, liberatory moments where you get to escape from the outside world. You get to be around people that inspire you, people who are turning looks, people who are just excited to be alive in that moment. And there's some really like interesting, maybe like like laws that are bended on the dance floor. For example, like gravity is like maybe more fluid or less relevant. The distance between your body and mine is sometimes confused. Sometimes we become one body. Sometimes we're separate. Sometimes we pass through each other. I think that there's a lot of really interesting ways that we allow ourselves to interact on the dance floor that can be like transported back into the quotidian, back into the everyday. And so thinking about these like spaces that exist, actual spaces that exist, like a dance floor, thinking about the ways that we interact with each other in those spaces, and then importing those actions back into everyday life. And so for example, these get-ups were these pieces that, here's one of them. This one says direct action. And there's the video that goes along with it called Direct Action on the Dance Floor. But basically, like, the way that this works is it gets tied to, so it's like a square piece. And this gets tied to another piece on the back and around the sides. And so the top piece has like the first part of a fragment of a saying, and then the back piece has the second part of a phrase. And the idea is that when you're dancing with other people, you start to like form these new phrases with them that speak to like the liberatory potential of the dance floor. So it's like it's definitely like it's something that I designed for use on the dance floor, but the meaning is kind of up to the ways that people decide to dance around each other.
And you've used these on actual dance floors?
Yes, I haven't used them in a while, and I don't have many of them left, but I think I want to do more here in Chicago.
Okay. And so when you talk about how these actions on the dance floor get taken out into the everyday, what does that mean, and what does that look like?
Well, I mean, my hope with like a piece like that is that it's not the results aren't predetermined, that people will interact with the pieces and then be able to take their own sort of interpretation back into real life. But I think for me, what's interesting about the dance floor is just that our relationships to our bodies are much looser, much more generous, much more vulnerable. It's sweaty, but it's also joyful. And these are like all like conditions that we don't normally experience with each other on a day-to-day basis. And so kind of thinking about the dance floor as a metaphor, but also like maybe like if we introduce some of these sort of qualities into the everyday, then we might start to relate to each other in different ways. So
is it more of a state of mind that we're...
Yeah, I'd say like more of like state of mind, I guess. Yeah, and it's not all the pieces are necessarily like this, where they have like some sort of application in the real world. A lot of them kind of just like exist in this like weird fictional non-world, but kind of using that as like a case study or something. Yeah.
Well, you write about non-worlds. You wrote a piece about parades, and I want to read the last paragraph from it. And it says, it's on Arena, and it says, when utilized as an emancipatory mode of sociality, the parade is a nomadic network of interdetermined activities that insist on something else. For those who seek to maintain the current order of things, the parade's biggest threat is not its size, its type, or its destination. It is the potential to transmute the ephemeral into the perpetual. Paraders at the end of the world are petitioners against the normative order of space and its agreed upon use. Together they ask, what might it mean to exist outside of systems of control while inside the embrace of others? And I thought that was just a really beautiful way of talking about, at once being outside, but also inside. And so when you make work like this, is the intention that it begins to spread a locus of activity outward, or like what do you hope to happen in the world as a result of these kinds of things existing?
I guess I'll say that honestly, I don't have many expectations for what kind of impact the work might have.
Why not?
I like write and make these things because I feel compelled to, and because I get interested in something and want to explore it um, and and like transmute it into some sort of work. But then after that, it's kind of, I don't know. Then it's out in the world, and then it's kind of out of my hands in a way that like I really enjoy it. But also, yeah, I'm not. I'm trying to write and make work about different ways of being together, or ways that we're already together that maybe require a second look. And because I'm just really interested in the question of what it means to be alive today. And so these works are just a way to figure out how to be alive with each other.
You know, I just realized that I'm asking you questions like you're a designer. And I'm like, well, what's the point? What does it do? Why does it exist? What is it for? I'm forgetting that maybe that's not the point. I
think that's a good. I think that was kind of something that like I had to. I feel like I've been like kind of like shedding through like my career is just like I mean, honestly, it's so fascinating to think about like why I was drawn to design in the first place is because a lot of it comes from this evangelical Christian sort of mindset of transforming the world, of creating a better image of the world. And so I think I like even went into grad school with this sort of evangelical mindset of like design can reshape the world. It can like create a better, and I think that I think like in different ways the world has pushed back against my understanding of what design should or shouldn't do, to the point where I've kind of resigned to not create with any sort of desire to disrupt the world or like anything like that. You know, like I just I think and it's also freeing because then there's no responsibility to like see it through to this sort of like important public social use. And instead we can just step back and be like, okay, like, well, wait a second. I wake up every day and I make actions that determine a certain way of being in the world, and other people are also making actions around me, and we're all kind of like living and working and slowly transforming the world together. And so I think the question has been more just like, okay, like how am I just like being with people? Yeah.
I mean, I think that's really true because I think a lot of us come to design as a way of controlling the world, as a way of reshaping and remaking it. And there's kind of a constant desire to do so, probably fueled by capitalism. But, you know, to begin to think about design as a way of liberating the world makes it seem to me like the tools of design aren't just for commercial application, but they could potentially be tools for living. And I think that's what's exciting about seeing your practice take up those ideas and bring them back to the fore. And, you know, how, what do you think that conversation that you're trying to have how well do you think that conversation is reaching maybe the next generation of designers? Like how does it? Because you do some writing about pedagogy,
Mm-hmm.
some very interesting writing about pedagogy. Yeah, and so how do you see that beginning to make its way into pedagogy? That conversation.
Yeah, great question. Hmm.
I got lots of them.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I'll say that like I'm not a professor. I've never like taught a class. So I don't have a lot to say about pedagogy outside of just have like being like on the student side of it.
Mm-hmm. Would you
But
ever teach?
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And I've done like workshops and stuff like that, but I never taught like a course. And I um, I think what's exciting especially about like radical pedagogy, is that it's this practice where it's co-determined. Like we're like humans in a space deciding um, to really wrestle with this topic or these series of topics, um, and uh, and I think it's really exciting when people are allowed to um, basically like cross these new knowledges with the obsessions that they already have, and I think that I um, yeah, I'm curious about what that means for young people nowadays, and
Mm.
what like I feel like Tumblr has like soft radicalized like a whole generation. There's all these like tiny like socialist minded folks um, posting, and and it's also then filtered through like social media and the surveillance
Mm-hmm.
state and like all these sorts. It's this huge mess, but yeah, I think that that also means it's kind of like exciting, especially to see that the ways that especially young people. So like when I was growing up, there was like a before the internet, and then we had internet. And now it's just like there's internet. It's like a given. And so yeah, I'm really like excited, I guess, to see what that means for how people are going to continue to envision the world.
And this is obviously a conversation that is happening all over different academies. This idea of decolonizing design. And you recently wrote a piece for The Walker that was part of a series that was guest edited by Nicole Killian. And your piece.
Shout
Yeah,
out.
hey, shout out Nicole Killian. And it's called Let's Talk About Body Reproduction. And in it, you present this idea of the stunt double as a strategy, maybe, or a tactic for thinking about representation in design. And I'm guessing that it's really about design history, and what we've told ourselves is the main actor versus the stunt double. Can you tell our audience a little bit about that idea of the body double?
Definitely. So that idea is born out of this like ongoing research practice that I have on queer anarcho-punk scenes from the late 80s and early 90s. And I was, like the first, like, I don't know, definitely like 6 months to a year that I was pouring through these zines. I was kind of just like absorbing all of this. And also just like, it was a really incredible, so I started like researching these in the fall of 2016. So this is like post-election. And I
Dark
think,
times.
yes, and I think like at that time, I was definitely hungry for like looking for historical examples of queer resistance, and so I started like focusing on these punk zines, and I was just so fascinated by the fact that they're using technologies like a Xerox that like reproduces, but they're using it to reproduce new ideas, to challenge old ideas, to cut up, old pictures of like George Bush one, and like putting his face on like a sadomasochist, image on and putting on a cover, and like so like kind of like remixing the world. And I think that these, I think that my reading and my opinion of it is that these people were actually able to do this in such a unique way because of their queerness, and because I think that queers are kind of like cut off from the normal reproductive sort of logic of the world, and we don't inherit histories or property, for that matter, in the same way as happens through like heteronormative patriarchal relations of passing down through inheritance, and so I think because queers kind of like exist outside of that mode of being in the world, or are able to, or are able to maybe start thinking from that position, we can actually think about new ways to deal with histories, to make new histories, and decide which ones we want to take into the future. And so this idea of the stunt double is this way of like, so like to stunt double the past in the essay. It's been a while since I love it, but the idea of stunt doubling is to a stunt double is this person like the actor who will risk more, who will jump through the fire, or jump great leaps, and so this was kind of like a strategy that I was seeing in the zines themselves, where they were taking old material and they were putting them to new use, to new like radical liberatory use. And even, for example, the term queer, this was the time in modern history when queers were reclaiming language. They were reclaiming words like queer or faggot or dyke, and using it actually to envision like a positive reimagining of the world. And I think too, like what's interesting about the punk ethos of like no future was something that was this actual kind of like literal condition of queers at the time. So being outside of like the normal logic of reproduction, but also the AIDS epidemic, and just a whole generation of people gone. And so this is things that they were wrestling with, and so I think they were really serious about thinking about what it means to take the history into the future. And so anyways, back to the stunt double. The idea is that we take these old ideas and we kind of like put them through the fire, and if they cause us to risk too much, or if they basically it's a way for like it's a way to think about, okay, what do we want to reproduce, what don't we want to reproduce, what new things do we want to take into our understanding of what a future might look like.
When I read it, I loved that idea because just the notion of acknowledging that what you're seeing is another body, and that body might look similar, but it's actually not. I think that's a powerful idea in terms of ways of us as designers or people to make an attempt at rewriting the history of our profession
Yes.
in ways that are that acknowledge some things that we have not seen
Yeah.
previously.
Yeah. And I think it's about enacting new ways of relating to each other. It's about highlighting sidelined or erased histories. But it's also about this like wrestling, like in the mess, in the dirt, with the given history, with the given conditions that we have. You know, it's not about starting from ground zero. It's not about actually like restarting the world. That's like a genocide dream. You know,
Right.
that actually like fits into like the imperialist colonial settler logic of we have this like empty land. Oh, look at this new empty land that we have. Let's settle our new colonies on top of it. When in fact it's like, well, actually no. This land has history. This land has people that you're actually like literally erasing off the earth. And so I think that it's important to not kind of I think it's important that we're like sitting with the mess of what we have. And not just, trying to wipe the slate clean.
Yeah, I love contending with the mess.
Yes.
Nate, we have a few minutes left in our time together. I want to talk about future projects, things that you have in the hopper, in the queue, that you're thinking about and working on for the future, your future, our future, the collective future of humanity. What do we have to look forward to?
So that parade text actually that I published with Arena is getting published into a small book by Inga Books here in Chicago.
Exciting.
And that's going to come out next month. And I've got show of video works opening at Vox Populi in Philly next week, and they'll have like a couple new video works, and I've also some like more felt wearables and performative stuff. But as far as like actual ideas that I'm trying to work through, so I'm still thinking about literacy as a mode of dealing with the world, and sort of this like ongoing project that I'm trying to think through right now is ways to like harness literacy. So I'm actually like in the process of designing these like literacy harnesses that fit onto the body. And they are these they're these wearable works that act as like a they carry like a book specifically. So I'm like, I have these like conditions for like what a literacy harness is, but it's basically this harness that holds a book, and the book is important for the wearer because the book allows them to read the world in a new way that enables them to rewrite it. So these are like transformative books that have like caused us to like step back and reevaluate the world. And then the harness itself kind of takes the form of some of the ideas that the book espouses. So it's still something I'm like sketching out and making some prototypes of. But yeah, that's the kind of a project I'm working on right now.
What are some of those books for you that have changed you?
Yeah.
You can think of right off the top of your head. I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah. So I mentioned that book, Please Kill Me, the oral history of punk rock. Dispossessed, The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. Donna Haraway's recent book, being with, what is it called? It's called Staying with the Trouble.
I don't think I know that. Staying with the Trouble.
Staying with Trouble. Excellent book. Yeah, I have to think about that some more. I'm still
Okay.
I'm still working that out.
Well, it's almost lunchtime. Since this is universal lunch, we like to ask people what are they going to have for lunch today?
I think I'm gonna make some soup with some ingredients that I have left over in my fridge.
Very good. Um,
How
I'm
about
trying to
you?
think. Well, I have a fantasy of eating lunch today, but I think I'm gonna, how on RuPaul's Drag Race, when they do the final interview on the podcast and she gives them one Skittle. I think that's what I'm gonna have for lunch today is a Skittle. And then I'm gonna have to move on to my next thing that I have to do. Um, are you currently are you just in Chicago doing your practice? Do you have a day job or like what is your like life setup right now?
Yeah. So here in Chicago, I just moved here in August, so I'm still getting settled. And I'm doing freelance design work right now. But just trying to kind of take it slow and just try to write a lot. I encourage anyone watching who's thinking about writing more to write more. Writing is awesome. I love writing. I get really excited when I hear people talking about writing. I think it's just like a really important tool that we have at our disposal.
Well, okay, this is a great way to end. Is to talk about writing. And writing is a thing that I try to get my students to do in my classroom. They're very resistant to it, but I think writing is how we begin to cement and make our discipline stronger, right?
Yes.
But there are so many barriers to designers writing.
Yeah.
Did you ever face those barriers, and how did you get out of that? How did you like come to love writing? I think that's a hard thing to achieve for a lot of designers.
Yeah. Um, I that's a great question. I need to think about this a little bit more, but it was I obviously like writing assignments suck.
Yeah, of
But
course.
it's like, but I think that like uh, once I what I why so I think why I started like writing in earnest was because I was reading a lot. But when you're reading, you're like not you can underline things, but like in like a month you're gonna forget what you just read. I mean, maybe some of it is like stirring in your soul and like affecting like your life, but the rest of it is just gone. And so writing for me is always a way to pin things down. So like if there's like an idea that I think is really interesting somewhere else, I want to take note of it and then maybe like digest it through writing. So, for example, like Kathy Acker's practice, Kathy Acker's like this radical novelist, and a lot of her work is literally appropriated, where she was like mixing. She wrote this book, Great Expectations, which mixes Charles Dickens's Great Expectations with like porn novels and like stuff like that. And so like she was interested in these sort of like remixing and just like feeding your influences into a writing practice. I'll end with some advice that both Kathy Acker and Stephen King offer is that you should write 1,000 words a day. So that's a lot, but I think that's kind of like for like maybe if writing is something that someone wants to be more interested in or to work through, is to just write. Got to write every day. Got to write a lot. And most of it's going to be shit, because that's most of what we make as artists and designers is shit, and it's usually just like the every once in a while we make something cool and exciting. But it's important, I think, just to continue generating, to continue writing. And then when you're excited about something that you've written or thought about, share it. Yeah, that would be like my advice to students.
Um, do you write? Is there a space where we can read your writing on the regular? Or I'm like, do you have a blog?
You can find my live journal, my Zanga. No,
Right. I'm like, do you still have one?
I'm sure it's out there somewhere. Oh God. But yeah, I don't publish. I only like share when I'm like ready to
Yeah,
write.
that
But
makes sense.
I think like that's a good assignment actually though, is to publish more in general, even if it's just like some trivial thoughts like on a Tumblr or whatever. And it doesn't even matter if anyone's following. That's even better. Great. The stakes are low. You can write whatever.
Even better if no one's following you.
Exactly. So I feel like, yeah, I should probably, and also like if you're like writing and publishing in that way, it allows for shorter, quicker bursts of thoughts and yeah.
Like an apple, right? Every day.
Yes.
Nate, we're waiting for our next guest to come on, and she's out of Santa Fe, so she has to like go to the library because she lives in an Adobe house and there's no internets in Santa Fe. Yeah, so I'm gonna chit chat with you until Jan arrives. But Jan is a writer. Are you familiar with her work? Maybe. You might be familiar with one of her books. She did a book with Peter Hall a while back called Elsewhere Mapping that you might have seen. Did we get to talking about Art Guys?
No.
Oh, no, I didn't talk to you about Art Guys. Let's talk about Art Guys. Do you know Art Guys?
Sorry, just broke up for a second.
Oh, yeah. Do you know about Art Guys?
Oh, yeah. You meant you sent me something. I didn't know about them before you... No, I didn't know about them before you shared.
Oh, you're going to love them.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, they're this art duo based out of Houston, and they did a lot of kinds of I guess you could classify it as performance, but it was just really forms of art that dealt with the everyday and made everyday things more accessible to a wider audience. And so what they before the internet, they did a piece where they commissioned a set of suits from the designer Tom Brown, and they sold ad space on their suit, and they wore it around for a year.
Okay.
And recently, in 2013, and I'm so sad that in 2013 I was living in Texas, but not, aware of in the world. And they did a series of 12 performances in 2013, Houston, that I just missed, and there are things out in the world that you would probably love and then you just miss and now they're gone.
Yeah, happens.
Anyway, I thought you would appreciate their body of work.
Thank you. Yeah, I will definitely look more into them. I appreciate that. And also this book sounds fascinating, that the Elsewhere mapping.
Yeah, it's great. And Peter Hall is actually working on a new book about data and mapping that's, talking about our surveillance state, our... it's dark.
Yeah, super dark.
Yes. All right, Nat Pyper. I won't keep you anymore, but I'm going to wait for Jan. Nat Pyper, thank you for joining us on Universal Lunch today. It was
Jimmy, thanks so much.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks for the invitation.
Good. Thank you.
Talk soon.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, you know what? At this point, I will also like to give a shout out to all the magical people that make Universal Lunch happen. We have two behind the scenes director, producer people, Kelly Cree and Jessica Mullen, who have an outfit called School of Life Design. And every week they operate our behind the scenes camera switching, putting these graphics over my face. Maybe while we're waiting for Jan, we can get Kelly or Jessica to come on. And hello. Yes, BTS, Kelly Cree, and Jessica Mullen. While we're waiting for Jan, I will recount some memories that I have of my encounters with Jan. So recently, I was at this conference at Yale that was put on by Jeff Kaplan called After the Bauhaus, Before the Internet, A History of Graphic Design Pedagogy, which I'm going to ask Jan to talk about here in a second. And, oh, do we have Jan? Is Jan on? No, not yet. Anyway, so at this Yale conference, there's all these people in the auditorium, like, the brain trust of design pedagogy. Everyone is there. And it was just intimidating to be in the room. And at the end of the conference, they asked Jan to do a kind of wrap up of her thoughts about what has gone on at the conference. And Jan gets up to the podium, and I think we're just expecting someone to wrap it up. And so she starts getting into it, and it evolves into a kind of spoken word rap performance thing that, I had a bootleg audio of this that I was going to play. And I think Jan has some video, maybe she'll share it with us, of this thing that she did. But it made me think about, her future as a spoken word artist / rapper. And so I'm looking forward to asking Jan about that when she joins us. Yes, we have contact. Yes, Jan.
Okay, now I can't see me though. That's the problem. Hi, Jimmy.
Hi. Contact with Jan.
I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, video, 2 videos. There, good.
Yes. Yes. Okay, let me rewind. Jan, welcome. Take a minute to catch your breath.
I need to.
I will end our phone call. And let me take a minute and for both of us to recalibrate, and then I will intro you. My next guest, arriving in fabulous fashion, is Janet Abrams. Janet Abrams is an artist, writer, editor, and producer based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where internet is difficult. After many decades as an architecture and design critic, 4 years at Princeton University, where she earned her PhD in architectural history, and 8 years running the University of Minnesota Design Institute. She returned to graduate school in 2008, earning her MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art at age 50. These days, she divides her time between her studio practice as sculptor, mostly in ceramics and bronze, and her editorial work, chiseling texts in Word and Adobe Acrobat. Editor of If Then Play from 1998, and co-editor with Peter Hall of Elsewhere Mapping from 2006, she is currently completing 2 more books, WWW Drawing, Architectural Drawing from Pencil to Pixel, based on the Eponymous project developed at Penn State University, to be published by Actar Barcelona, as well as Daddy Wouldn't Buy Me a Bauhaus, an anthology of her major profiles of architects and designers, to be published in fall 2020 by Princeton Architectural Press. Jan Abrams, welcome to Universal Lunch.
Well, I hope I can stay with you. This is one of the perils of living in Adobe land. I trusted the library to have a better connectivity than my own cottage, whose thick walls are like a Faraday cage, repelling cell phone and internet connection at the least opportunity. So I thought I would be better at the library, but turns out not today. Go ahead.
Okay, well, we worked through it. I am going to dig into some meaty things right away, because I have so many questions to ask you. And the first thing I want to talk about is your fabulous, I think, career, from writing to being in academia to now sculpture and art. Tell us about how you think about that progression now at the other side of that wonderful arc, and still going, might I add.
Yes, very much still going, and very much a work in progress to figure out what I actually did when I kind of took off from my career to date in 2008 to go back to school to study fine art at the ripe old age, as I told you in my bio. I can't say I've figured it out. It's still very much a precarious existence post that phase, but I'm looking at ways of integrating the rather distinct chapters of my career right now, and this opportunity to talk to DesignInquiry is one of those, helps, prods along the way. I'm really happy to have been invited and to, for example, have taken part in the conference that Jeff Kaplan organized at Yale in May, where you and I met, and actually I met much of the DesignInquiry framers of the Constitution, or whatever you call yourself. For the first time in reality, because I knew of them obviously through Peter Hall, my dear colleague, co-editor of the book on mapping, and my senior editor at the Design Institute in Minneapolis for many, many years, who I enjoyed watching on one of your previous episodes just now. So basically, I am still figuring out how to make an existence as a sort of independent writer, editor, and now fine artist, studio artist. But I think that some of the threads are coming together. I mean, I see myself as somebody who could now offer a different kind of insight into the kinds of questions that I was dealing with when I was mostly a design and architecture critic. That was like the first 25, 30 years of my working life. Then the period at the University of Minnesota, where I was in charge of a research center with a kind of remit to create the direction of the research and to sort of decide what was the specific nature of that interdisciplinary umbrella that I was trying to create under the heading of Design Institute. And I think now that I've been in the environment of making by hand, although also obviously with tools and equipment, not in my case so far using CAD technology, but that's certainly come into play as a lot of ceramists are already using that. There's some very, very interesting examples of what one would think of as crafts makers engaging with 3D technologies. But I think that having literally put my hands into the muck for most of the 2 years at Cranbrook, I actually did a lot of non-clay work, as is the wont of students at Cranbrook, where I studied.
Of course.
Be admitted to a department based on some kind of a portfolio. In my case, it was what I'd done in evening classes at the Northern Clay Centre after hours from my job at the university. And then as soon as you get there, you're pretty much allowed to stray to whatever materials, whatever department heading that might fall under. It didn't matter so long as you could argue the reason for using that materials to realize the particular concept you were working on. And so I found myself thinking a lot about debates about craft, about the differences between craft and art, between art and design. And at the moment, which is to say 90,000 words into a memoir of those 2 years at Cranbrook, which I say 2 years or 4 years counting the nights, I still don't have the exact answer, but I will have some ruminations to share, hopefully within the next couple of years when that book project has made its way to a completed first draft. Bit delayed by the other 2 books that you mentioned, which I've been very much busy with last year. But I'm deeply engaged in material activity now. I feel much more grounded by that, given that I spent the first majority of my career in my head, working in the malleable material of words and ideas that are usually expressed verbally, whether written or verbally. And now that I have really been exposed in the most intensive way at that art school to the language of materials and the ways of expressing ideas through physical artifacts, although obviously some art is not just physical. Conceptual work is also done at Cranbrook, maybe to a lesser degree than at other art schools. But I went there really knowing that that was the reputation of that particular school, and I wanted that exposure. And it has given me a lot more feeling of really understanding how things are made and what the limits are and what the magic is of material. So that's a kind of quick update to where I am, but ask me another.
Well, you mentioned that you were making work at night school. Like, did you, in your time as a writer, have you always been making things in the background or did that desire grow stronger as you went through your career? Looking at so many. I would say that it was something that was pretty much put on hold after high school. I went to architecture school in London. I went to the Bartlett School of Architecture, which is part of London University. And I'd been to a very, very academic high school in London where it was extremely sort of oriented to getting as many of the girls, because it was a private school for girls, into Oxford and Cambridge. There was even what was called the Marble, which was the main entry hall of the school, had marble plaques on the walls into which the names of the girls who won scholarships to Oxford and Cambridge were literally carved each year and then gilded. So that was not to be my choice. In the end, I didn't become one of those. I didn't even apply to those universities. But I went to the university in London, where I'd grown up and where the school was, to study architecture, thinking that it might be a good hybrid between my interest in the sciences and math and in art. I was wrong. It making buildings, and it does call on those skills, but at a particular time that I was at that school, which was at the end of the 70s, before Peter Cook of Archigram fame became the school's director just shortly after I'd left, and when colour was readmitted to student work, we were confined to working with rotring ink on mylar using giant desks with parallel motions in those days. So to me, that architecture degree was very, very different from what I'd expected. And it was pretty much the moment that I chose to become a writer, actually, because in the very last semester of the last year, I'd done enough of the requirements to qualify for exemption from the first part of the official Royal Institute of British Architects qualification, so as to go on to become an architect. I decided I didn't want to do that, but I was able to take one semester to do a sort of experimental writing project under a mentor who is of blessed memory called Stephen Groack.
And he encouraged me to just try writing, which was great because I, by that time, had just got myself a spot on a journalism training course, which was what I did for the next, I think, 3 years. So that writing self-assigned projects to write about various aspects of contemporary architecture, jewelry, advertising design that I picked in my 3rd year as an undergraduate was very formative for how I proceeded into my writing career. And I can riff on that. I really was very interested in looking at Peter's video, Peter Hall's description of his years at Design Week, which probably were a few years behind mine because we're a little far apart in age, but very, very similar experiences of coming up as a writer through the most commercial publishing environment rather than through academic writing. So I'll pause on that thought and you can ask me to clarify or change subjects.
Well, I want to, because I'm so interested, and I think a lot of, designers who are, making stuff are increasingly, it's important, or it's becoming important for the discipline that designers begin to write. And
yes.
Can you maybe talk about how has your relationship to writing changed since, pivoting and focusing on making? And like, do you have thoughts for designers who should be writing and aren't?
Well, I want to take that up very immediately because actually it was the subject of a conversation I had just yesterday, and it seems to be the case, you're right, that there is an emphasis or an awareness in academic programs of design that it's not going to suffice for their students to graduate with skills in design and obviously equipped to use all the latest software, which is a whole other part of the discussion about actually learning about design. It is much more than the technologies. But to add to that, this dimension of self-reflection about what one is making and how writing can become a component of that self-reflection, I think is a really interesting that it's happening now as maybe the actual skills of design are becoming a little bit more universalized because, I remember when desktop publishing came on, everybody said they were a graphic designer all of a sudden. Well, no, they weren't. But they still put out publications, which would make my teeth great. And most people with a MFA or an undergraduate graphic design degree would also have the same reaction, but that didn't stop it. So part of this is probably to do with a wish to differentiate between the more learned and well-versed in history of contemporary graphic design and in precursors to what one might be doing and to the languages of typography around the world and not just what's available when you purchase them online. In terms of my own practice, I have noticed a change in my writing. I mean, that's what's coming up in the creation of this long work so far, several years of on and off attempt to write about what I experienced going from being really a kind of academic administrator. I like to call myself a sort of academic entrepreneur. When I was at the Design Institute, it was more like running a movie production company where I had a set of really close collaborators. My staff was pretty small, and bless them all, Deb Littlejohn, Peter Hall, Wendy Friedmeier, Kate Carmody, Mary DeLate, etc. And obviously, we produced a lot, but with a large, what we used to refer to as a flying circus of Design Institute fellows who were people that we could commission almost like freelancers to take on different projects. But that experience was very, very different running an organization, even if it was a relatively small one within the giant university. Running that was very different than going back to being a student, where it was really about what I could produce and where I could draw on within myself, my psyche, basically, to have artistic ideas that were worth making. And all of those questions are really not up front, I think, when you're in a managerial position. You've got other kinds of responsibilities. And so it was very challenging, very stressful, very emotional, much of that time. And I'm trying to evoke that as I write this reflection on the transition that I made from being somebody who had mainly written about other people's creativity, very interested in that process and the variety thereof, as witnessed. Well, you'll see this in the book of profiles that I'm doing with Princeton Architectural Press, the pieces that I had written in the 80s through the 2000s, mostly for magazines like Blueprint in London and ID Magazine here. I was on the editorial teams of both at different times. But those profiles were about me meeting people who are either emerging or fairly well established or just about to become household names, like Frank Gehry and Rem Koolhaas, who in the mid-'80s were not so well known, at least not in England. But basically, to go from being somebody whose métier was to attend carefully and thoughtfully to what these creative practitioners said they were doing and compare that with what I saw them actually producing in terms of the output, like finished buildings that they might just have completed at the time that I was invited to interview them. That's a very different thing than turning the lens on yourself, especially in your mature years, as I was. I was twice the age of most of my classmates, and they were my teachers. And I really, really am grateful to having had that experience of learning again, which I think is not the opportunity that so many people get after they've been through the typical years of college, which let's roughly say are like late teens into 20s or late 20s if you do further graduate studies. But I had this opportunity to learn again how to learn in a different set of media and processes and way of thinking. And I still haven't really nailed, for my own satisfaction, but it will come out hopefully in the course of writing this book, what the differences are between the thinking that goes into design and the thinking that goes into making art. I think there are a lot of overlaps, but there are definitely distinctions. And don't ask me what they are yet, because I can't give away the speech answer.
Well, I guess I'm not. I think there are distinctions, right, between writing about art and design and making art and design. But I'm wondering about now that since you have those things as a writer, as a part of your being almost, does that become a tool in the making? Like, is writing, how can writing become a tool?
I don't know that it's a tool so much as it can be an impediment to the kind of studio making. And I had a studio visit recently by Lisa Lefebvre, who has within the last year she's actually now based in Santa Fe. She's become the head of the Holt-Smithson Foundation. I did an interview with her for a local magazine called Southwest Contemporary, or The Magazine as it used to be. And so after we'd done that, she paid me a studio visit, which was great because I'd known of her for a long time because she'd been at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds in England as the head of sculpture studies and among other roles. So I really wanted to get her take on what I'd been making. And she observed that probably for me, making these physical, large-scale ceramic and smaller scale, but still damn heavy bronze pieces was a way, a sort of decoy from words. It was a way to shut words out. And I think she has a point that while I'm making, obviously there's a kind of stream of consciousness dialogue passing through my head. But if I could record it, none of the sentences would end. It's really, and I think that's actually what I really cherish about making is the hours of that kind of non-outward conversation, that the process with my hands, shaping an object or just washing tools afterwards, or I don't know, sieving things, just the tiny, banal in a way, almost domestic gestures that are involved in the actual production of physical art objects is a meditative period, as well as often very stressful when you're trying to test glazes or hoping that the kiln will open and it hasn't cracked, etc. But I really found that kind of almost stream of consciousness thinking that happens, if I don't get that often enough, I mean, that's why people call it a practice. Artists need to do this regularly on a daily basis, hours at a time if possible, but at least some regular entry into that state of mind, because it's from that whole sentence, whole paragraph, argued, rational set of thoughts that are really kind of almost like, do you remember ever defragmenting a disc? Do you remember?
Yeah, I do remember.
I came into my apartment in New York 20 years ago to defrag my then, television set size, God knows what it was, Mac. And it was just beautiful to watch as the complete chaos of the colors, started to line up in bands of the right color, like, I don't know whether it was a rainbow, but basically to organize what had become so disorganized. But it's that relationship between chaos, or the inchoate, I would rather say, the morass in which there is some meaning, but the meaning needs to be allowed to come forward. And that's sometimes something you can do with deliberation, or it's something that comes out of an accident that you may or may not be in the right frame of mind to observe the positive out of the mess that you think is a disaster. And those are the kinds of things I learned at Cranbrook, which are very different from the kinds of goal-oriented and user-centered and all those phrases, pathways of thinking that I had encountered in the design world, and particularly towards the end of my time at the Design Institute, when there was a lot of discussion around the creation of the Stanford design, the D School. The connection between business, design, and engineering that were mostly prioritized in that new unit at Stanford, because those programs had existed separately. And so it was a period in which I suppose the sort of goal-oriented is the better way of putting it, or the sort of more directed processes of design and the design thinking process and the T-shaped person were being very much proposed and aerated by critics like Bruce Nussbaum in Business Week or whatever. And I just felt I needed to get away from all that and find another whole universe of approaching the material world, I suppose, from a more psychological point of view. And that related to some of the work I'd been doing personally for a long time, but we won't go into that here.
Well, I mean, I think that is a lovely distinction that you're making about the value of the art making process, that it's not always clear, it's not verbal, it's this kind of thing that happens in a magic black box sometimes. And I really wonder often how useful that kind of approach could be for designers, because you're right, oftentimes we're taught that this is a linear logical process,
a cyclical one where you design, you iterate, you review, you change, you try again, you test it on sample guinea pigs, quasi users, you come back to the process. There are a lot of models, there are a lot of maps, you could say, of how, like the famous Eames Venn diagram and those things, or the Bauhaus diagram of the relationship of the, let's say, the craft disciplines at the center of that concentric diagram, radiating to the outer rings, which are more recognizable as the kind of design activities that took hold in the 20th century. I wanted to say that I think what DesignInquiry has been, am I saying this right? I would say DesignInquiry because I'm English. Which? The latter?
The latter, either way is good.
Okay, well, I'm sure Peter says DesignInquiry, but he may have.
He does.
What I observe, and I wish I've I'd had a chance to come up to Vinalhaven, I mean, reading about the venue really made my mouth water. It reminds me of a lot of the kind of venues that art residencies are based in, which are
absolutely
a little rustic, maybe a little rough at the edges. There's more. I wrote down a sentence which I like very much from the piece on the Design Observer article. The discomfort only happens in tandem with a growing sense of trust and companionship that emerges as people live, eat, and work together. And I thought, that was the magic at Cranbrine. You said a black box. I want to just point out that it wasn't all, sparkly magic wands and inspiration. It was damn hard. It was often very uncomfortable. You're living cheek by jowl with people. You're cooking in the same, square meters as everybody busy at work. There's a lot of stress. So I want to convey that in this book. But I read this sentence and I thought, there is something that we are trying to recoup in these ventures. Yours, let's say Morgan Pewitt and Mark Dion's Mildred's Lane project, which you probably know about in Pennsylvania, where there is a tight weave between the kind of research and creative activities and a form of domesticity tied to place, tied to a landscape or a set of buildings within a particular setting. And in some respects, the separation of that venue from normal life, or from the internet in your case, which to most people represents civilization, or, to remain tethered to your otherwise activities, is severed once you get to the DesignInquiry venue. Long time ago, I organized a retreat that took place for 4 years in a row in a boathouse in the Adirondacks. I co-organized this with the industrial designer Donald Carr and his wife, Liza Lamb, who's also a designer. And that was in the late 90s. And again, I was at ID Magazine writing, but I felt a need for a kind of conversation that could be sustained for longer than like the Q&A after a really good talk, like in New York, hosted by the AIGA or the Urban League or whatever it would be as a sort of organized event. I wanted to have conversations that could spread their tentacles beyond an agenda that was current, let's say, in the sort of defined culture of design. And I see that that's very similar in your non-schedule business, the way that you frame these repeated annual or more frequent events, but mainly the sort of annual summer event, as I understand it, so as to permit unexpected directions to emerge and relationships to happen over the dish drying or whatever it is. And I wonder whether that really is about a kind of a search for a domestic scale of encounter with people that has been pushed away for the last 100 and some years. It's the sort of thing that Richard Sennett has written about in his books. I'm trying to remember the name, The Corrosion of Character. That, I think, was the book where he really talked, the first I came across anyway, that he talks about the way in which work has really sort of alienated us. This is not a new topic, but I feel that what your venture and, as I said, Morgan's, or perhaps you and I talked about Chris Taylor's land arts program, where he takes an enormous, almost military truck to the sites of the major land artists' work in the Southwest with a group of students from Texas Tech Lubbock, where he's a professor, but also people who fly in from wherever and with whatever background. So it's a different kind of cohort than a typical class at a university. Similarly, your venture is self-selecting who applies. Do you have a sort of filtering process for admissions?
There is an application, and then they're reviewed. And I've never participated in the selection process, so I can't really speak to it. But there is a short application, and you kind of say, like, why do you want to be there? And I think the why is always important because, as you know, it's definitely not for everyone.
Well, I don't know that, but I can imagine. Actually, that brings a rather funny moment to mind, which I may reference. I think that where I first encountered this, other than in my own, happenstance, rule of thumb as I made it up ventures, both the one I talked about called the Long Lake Design Camp, the one in the Adirondacks Boathouse, which I guess overlapped or came towards the end of the 90s. And I'd done this thing at Cooper Union called Dialogue, which was a set of evenings that I ran 2 or 3 years, can't remember exactly, but there were like 3 or 4 sessions per season where the full title was Dialogue, Real-Time, Real-Time Debates on Design, Technology and Popular Culture, or Blind Dates. That's what it was, Real-Time Blind Dates. So the purpose was to bring together people from totally different fields whose work I thought had some common denominator, whether they recognize it at all, and it would turn out yes or no during the evening as to whether, in fact, my hunch was correct, that they shared some underlying set of interests, even if one was a typographer and the other was an acrobat, or one was a political scientist and the other designed theme parks. So those conversations were a kind of testing ground for what now I suppose is widely known as interdisciplinarity, or even, dare I say it, and I know I'm going to get, hurled bananas at for saying intersectionality, because that has different connotations. But this urge to find ways to meet people who are maybe from a different context than you, whatever you measure that, and enjoy and appreciate finding the common ground. That's, to me, is the most marvelous thing. I mean, that obviously is something that is being horribly quashed right now in some areas of our political culture. But I am an advocate of that, and I believe strongly that by finding those points of connection with people, your own humanity is expanded. It can't be other than that. So anyway, I've sort of lost the thread, but I do feel that these ventures, DesignInquiry, Mildred's Lane, Land Arts, the Long Lake Design Camp, I can think of a few others, are, and we talked yesterday about this whole alternative art school movement, are attempts to reinfuse learning with some of the intimacy and the openness that perhaps has been squeezed out of formal academic learning environments, with all the political correctness and the trigger warnings and things. I mean, I'm wondering whether these smaller ventures in aggregate, obviously they won't necessarily form a single unit at any point, but with the growth of these kinds of ventures, that they may be the the harbingers of a really new kind of learning, which this type of opportunity to communicate, you and I, over YouTube from different time zones, to communicate to people all over the world, obviously that is where we're moving. So I have a lot of thoughts about what's becoming of education too.
Well, I would love to talk to you about that at length. So we are unfortunately running out of time on this broadcast.
Internet crisis.
But let me ask you to close our conversation today by putting on your critic hat. And I wonder, the benefits, the awesomeness of DesignInquiry and things like it are obvious to me and to a lot of people who have participated. What kind of critical questions might you ask of DesignInquiry in ways that might poke and prod at it as it moves into the future? And I would love to end with a stream of consciousness question series from you. So have at it, Jan.
You have to give me a lump of really moist clay so I can be kind of not thinking while I'm talking. I'm going to say one thing. I noticed as an interviewer that the best stuff that I could get from people was often while they were driving me from wherever we met for the formal interview to the train station or whatever was my means of transport back to where I'd come from, because it's something to do with what is the word? Operational consciousness. That, you know, while you're driving, your other part of your brain is a little less.
Yeah, it's open.
Right, and so you rip because you're really focusing as well on the traffic lights. Hopefully, no, I'm not going to be able to do that without some clay, but I'll try. I think one of the things I thought about looking at the Instagrams of your current exhibition, the Futurespective, and the idea of this new voyage of inquiry open to all. I think what one thought was, I wish I had been to that exhibition. It's so difficult, even from a great selection of images, and even like enlarging them to read the text. I love the one about the 3 times a day kind of women pause or strike, which related to the historic suffragette period, I believe. And the variety of both content and visual expressions of the material just on that Instagram of that exhibition, which, of course, if I did an Instagram feed from that exhibition, my pictures would be very different because I would be taking my shots of what interested me. And I think that the difficulty, as a critic, I would say, you know, Pache not even having been there, it's just how does one, as an outsider to the experience that generated those artifacts, those documents, the printed matter, the visuals, the 3-dimensional objects or whatever, how do you edit those for a non-participant to enter? It is such a rich grab bag of stuff, but of so many kinds, so many different textures, you could say, and voices in the languages that are, you know, whether it's a sign or it's a statement inviting participation or it's a set of pages of something. There's a lot of like incommensurate material, which in a way is the signature of DesignInquiry. It's this cornucopia of expression. The question I would have is, do you want this to last forever? Do you feel that the continuity of this project is the most important thing? Or could it be that capping it in time, maybe say we'll do 2 more years of this and then we're going to stop? Because I'll relate 2 things. My experience as a magazine editorial team member was very rich, but it was important that those teams really had their kind of halcyon era. You could feel it. It wasn't always pleasant at the time, but the quality of the publications kind of reached an apogee at a certain year or 2 phase. And it cannot be sustained easily, usually because of financial issues, but also because people's talent will out and other people start to notice and poach those team members and they go on to new opportunities, which is great, which is what it should be. But the result is that that tight huddle cannot last forever. I saw the Design Institute as something that would probably last 5 years. Well, it actually went to 8 nearly, but it was better to see it as an experiment that one could kind of keep a safe zone around vis-a-vis the inevitable relationship between this experimental unit and the rest of the department colleges that I was working within, because there would be friction between something that had a worldview different from that of producing graduate students every year through a series of prescribed courses. That's not what we were doing. But in the case of a magazine, you know, culture moves on. So that group of people collected at a given time, your group that has sustained for a decade now or longer, with multiple examples and places that you've held your events with hundreds of participants. I don't know how many will repeat. We talked about that yesterday. But you've created a community, and you can't really expect it to last forever. That's not how life is. Things evolve. And so I would actually suggest to you that you think more about ways to do 2 things. One is creative archiving of what you've done, which you already have, but to think about how to express that in ways that will be meaningful to others 50 years from now, looking at the products, the manifest products, not the dialogue that took place over the dishes and the picking of the strawberries or whatever you did on Vinyl Haven, all of which are marvelous. And now we've got this multimedia documentation capacity. You could be doing that in many ways other than just printed objects, which are the preferred things designers, especially graphic designers, like to show for their efforts. But I would suggest that you consider that phrase, a new voyage of inquiry, and maybe make it, I'm probably preempting things you've already thought of as a group of framers, but maybe think about your next or next but one gathering as the centripetal, I think is the word I'm looking for, the one that spins things out, the one that thinks about what could these ideas that we've harbored together, what could they now go out as spores into the world to create? Or what are the settings, the many settings in which the energy and the creative ideas and the modi operandi that you've discovered by your I keep saying rule of thumb, but I don't mean that. Like in the moment exchanges, your adaptations to each other, your frictions, your discomforts. I read a lot of that word, discomfort, and I don't know exactly what you're referring to, but I think it's to do with what happens when people become, they feel comfortable enough in an environment that is not constraining them to their normal professional role to start to expose who they really are, what they really wish to do, what they would love to express. And the abundance of that is kind of overwhelming to the individuals and to the dynamics of that group. And the fact that you've held it together without giant conflicts, or you've converted that energy of conflict into productivity, is terrific. I think now is the time to look at the positive diffusion of what DI has been, and not to try to perpetuate it or just make more themes that produce more events on whatever venue with the same plus a few new people. I think you might actually be at the point where, let's say, the Blueprint magazine team was in, the original Blueprint magazine team was in, let's say, the early 90s after 6 or 7 years of intense work together. People split off to do a variety of things. We remain in touch with colleagues and friends, but we are not all in the same rickety room in central London trying to put out a monthly. We are museum directors, publishers, academics, multi-produced book editors or writers, like people like Rick Poynter and Dan Sujic and Stephen Coates, and thinking of them. So I would say try not to see it as the goal as being simply to keep it going. That may not be its best legacy.
Janet Abrams, what a beautiful question for us to consider. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you, and apologies for the derailment at the beginning. I'm just going to put in a plug to be invited to at least to be a fly on the wall at one of the next, maybe last few DIs, according to my philosophizing, because I've heard so much about it, obviously through Peter, who was building it with Margot. In many of the early years we were working together at the Design Institute. So congratulations, by the way, to the whole team.
Yes, congratulations to the whole team. I will go to Vine. I try to go every summer. I want to go every summer, but I can't always make it. Right. But if you are there, I will be there. We gotta be accountability friends. Again, thank you. This has been Universal Lunch. I'm Jimmy Liu, and next week we will be back together with my co-host Gabrielle Esperdy, where we will welcome, I believe, Vivian Sming from Sming Books in San Francisco, as well as Trisha Treacy and someone else that I'm forgetting now. It's been a very long day. Thank you, viewers out in internet land. We will see you next week.
Thank you.